The Chinese cuisine, often hailed as the richest in the world, truly possesses a culture that can combine unimaginable ingredients into a meal. However, you may wonder why there is hardly any proper food left, and some of you must be asking why these people like to find what ducks and insects enjoy. In fact, there is a much deeper and bitter reason behind this. Perhaps none of us, like ourselves, have the opportunity to understand it because none of us have had the reality of having to feed our families at noon. In China, despite the significant upheavals it has faced, you can always observe that its population is much larger compared to other countries. We don't exactly know why, but of course, we can make some speculations. China is one of the world's largest countries with highly productive lands. Due to climate diversity, agriculture has always played a crucial role, resulting in higher food production and population growth compared to neighboring countries. However, while a large population brings many advantages, it also remains a constant threat at the top of the country, like the sword of democracy. If managed well, it becomes a power, but in the slightest fracture, it poses a risk of self-destruction. So, how did the Chinese successfully manage this massive population for thousands of years? The answer is simple: through food and an iron-fisted authoritarian system. Especially in these systems, farmers are seen as robotic, and throughout Chinese history, we can see instances where production quotas were imposed on peasants. Peasants and villages subject to such quotas would be punished or have their allocated resources reduced if they failed to meet the demanded production. This often meant death for many. Consequently, peasants were forced to work tirelessly just to survive. This form of governance has been a force over the centuries, compelling the Chinese people to work and obey by threatening them with hunger. You might wonder, why don't these people rebel against such an oppressive regime? This is where it gets really interesting. When we look at Chinese history, yes, there have been some rebellions, but compared to revolutionary uprisings in other countries, they seem somewhat shallow. Harsh oppression on peasants has always persisted. There is an interesting claim related to rebellion. Although not scientifically proven, some researchers argue that the way societies consume food are intertwined with the inclination toward rebellion and war. For instance, societies with a diet heavy in red meat are considered more prone to war and aggression, while agricultural societies that rely more on vegetables and legumes have claims of reduced desire for conflict and rebellion, being more obedient. However, as I mentioned, this is not scientifically proven. Still, if we look at history, it somehow makes sense to me. Now, how do we connect all of this to the present day? It has been thousands of years, techniques have evolved, and food production has increased. Why do these people still seem stuck as if they have just emerged from scarcity? Some of you might say, what hunger is this? Here, we come to an event that, in my opinion, has washed away the psychology of the Chinese people and all ethical and empathetic feelings, the enormity. One of the most egoistic individuals in history and a maniac of egoism, Mao, is the prime example of what can happen when given great powers. Rising to the leadership of communist forces during the Chinese Civil War in 1921, he gained political power and subsequently, after the communist victory in 1949, ruled the People's Republic of China until his death in 1976. In 1958, Mao initiated a period known as the Great Leap Forward. His goal was to abandon the old culture and create a new, industrialized China. However, for those working in the colossal complexes built for Mao's obsessive obsession, it meant living and working solely in state-controlled factories, where payments were largely made in the form of food sufficient for survival. Those who did not want to work were likely to take their place in the factories. Of course, similar agricultural collectives were established to compensate this massive workforce with food, and unbelievable production quotas were implemented. Mao wanted the population to focus exclusively on industrial and food production. Anything else was to be erased from the people's memory. In 1966, he launched the Cultural Revolution movement, aiming to completely sever the ties of the Chinese people with their past. This movement involved gathering everyone, from those engaged in traditional crafts to those who kept historical books or artifacts at home, and sending them to labor camps to work to death. This movement, initiated in 1966, resulted in attacks on and destruction of ancient Chinese philosophy temples. During this period, there was an operation to erase people's past, beliefs, and values, essentially their identities. This can be seen as someone from one of the world's oldest and most significant ancient civilizations aiming to erase its own memory under the guise of modernization. All of this is thought-provoking, and it makes one wonder how people remained silent in the face of an operation aimed at erasing their past, beliefs, and identities. However, the Chinese rarely rebelled. There was an invisible reason, like a hidden cause of an overflowing cup. This reason dates back to the periods when Mao considered himself divine, particularly in 1958. Mao's attention was drawn to a simple observation: sparrows eating the fallen grains on the ground. Mao and his team, fearing that sparrows eating the grains in the fields would prevent the country from reaching its production quotas, ordered the hunting and killing of all sparrows. Despite being an irrational decision, it was carried out, resulting in the slaughter of millions of birds. This incident was celebrated as a great success. Here is the edited text. However, this inhumane massacre would have a horrifying consequence in the following years. It is said that there was a slight increase in production in the first harvest after the killing of birds, but it was minimal. Mao and his cabinet believed that this would lead to further increases in the future, but a different problem began to arise. A phenomenon occurred that seemed to have jumped out of stories told in the Bible and the Torah: an infinite invasion of locusts and insects. Since birds, the natural predators of insects, had been eradicated nationwide, insects had multiplied abnormally. Of course, the rats that fed on them also invaded the country. The destruction they caused was unimaginable. From crops in the fields to products in the warehouses, insects and rats attacked and consumed everything. Now, China began importing millions of sparrows from neighboring Russia, next to Authoritarian, but it was too late. Agricultural production had collapsed, and the breakdown of the food chain began to hit millions of industrial workers like a tsunami. This chain of events led to a deepening cheap food crisis in China, where approximately 800 million people lived at that time, and Mao's administration began to neglect rural people. To sustain industry, especially basic food exports from the Russians, peaked. However, as I mentioned, this food was brought more to maintain order in the cities. Contrary to what you might think, China, America, or any government doesn't really care about protecting their people. Their concern is the love of power and their own ideals, and in difficult times, the first group to be sacrificed is the people, especially those with low income levels. Look, don't forget my words. Sadly, one day you will remember. The Chinese government, as the first elimination category, selects communes in villages that fail to meet production quotas and almost completely stops food aid to those areas. Of course, what happened next is dreadful. People consume local creatures before starvation, and over time, livestock and natural habitats collapse in the region. Meanwhile, don't imagine this consumption as a pleasant hunting and cooking scenario. We are not talking about 3 to 5 people here, we are talking about millions of hungry people struggling to survive. When the devastation of these horrifying years, lasting for 3 years, reached its peak, people, upon finding any living creature in nature, would immediately tear it apart and eat it raw, like wild animals. Because there was no opportunity to clean and cook it. It's a waste of time, but it means someone else could see it and steal it from you, as survivors tell it. So, what do you think happened when animals ran out? People started eating insects, grass, herbs, tree bark, and even mud in succession. People gradually consume everything, and now there is nothing left for someone to eat or for them to eat. During this 3-year-long Great Famine, it is estimated that more than 60 million people died, according to current predictions. Those who died in labor camps or were slaughtered during the Cultural Revolution are not even included in this figure. Imagine, 60 million people are almost the population of Turkey just a few years ago. Just imagine people dying of starvation. It's unimaginable. In the following years, the famine problem was resolved, partly due to the deaths of millions, the rebalancing of ecology by sparrows, and imports. Now, some of you might be thinking, how did they let Mao live after these events? But you will be surprised, he lived quite well. He passed away at the age of 82 due to natural causes. Even his party did not collapse afterward. Today, the party he founded still leads China, and I can tell you this much, the mindset remains the same. So, now you probably understand why the Chinese eat everything. Think about it, people who survived by eating mud raised their children to see everything as food. This hunger trauma does not fade away for a few generations, and it has not even faded away in our time. In China, the consumption of insects, cats, dogs, and exotic animals is gradually decreasing, but remember what I mentioned in the video, a large population. In fact, it's a ticking time bomb, and a person's time is gradually running out. Since 2020, due to changing climate conditions and extreme demand, China's food production has started to fall behind, especially because of the massive water shortages in 2022 and 2023. Crop yields have significantly decreased in agriculture. According to a report published this year, the drought experienced in the last 2 years is expected to indirectly affect 900 million people in the coming years. Considering the country's population is around 1.4 billion, this is a very serious figure. Will China be able to overcome this problem? I highly doubt it. Because only due to the drought in 2022, the affected land in agriculture-intensive areas like Hunan is 2.2 million hectares. Just think about it. The total active cultivated agricultural area in all of Turkey is 8.4 million hectares. If you compare these numbers, you will better grasp the extent of the loss, and this is only the total of a few regions, not all of them. Now, this value opens up a whole new debate on its own. Yes, maybe this time they didn't kill the sparrows, but they experienced a crazy industrial growth, and as a result, rivers dried up or were severely polluted, making the water unusable for agriculture. Nature always has a balance, and if you disrupt it, you will face the consequences. So, I wonder, how do you think the results will be this time? As climate worsens and drought increases in the coming years, what will the affected 900 million people do? Share your thoughts in the comments, please. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, we just learned one of the reasons why the Chinese look at everything as food. Of course, there are historical and cultural reasons as well. However, this event is one of the biggest reasons. But the real question is, as the next famine gradually approaches China's doorstep, how will China cope with this famine?